There have been countless movies and TV series that depict the destruction or partial destruction of our country or some of our major cities. For example, the 2015 ABC series Designated Survivor. It dramatized what could happen if most of our key leaders were taken out. Then there are the movies whose plots were based upon an invasion from other countries, such as Red Dawn, which dramatized what the Western states would look like after being invaded by Russia. These are just a few of the what if situations used to capture our viewing attention and cause us to question how we might respond if one or more of these scenarios were to take place. Most Americans can't imagine this taking place because we tout ourselves as being one of the greatest countries in the world. However, we must remember that history is riddled with past nations and cities that thought this as well. There have been leaders to rise up throughout history who, at the time, seemed invincible. Alexander the Great, Nero, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, to name a few. Yet now they are no more. In Isaiah's day, Tyre and Sidon were Phoenician cities on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and were representative of the vast financial power of the Phoenician civilization. To the human eye, they seemed invincible, but we will discover in this session that they were no match for God. This week's Explore the Bible session, God Reigns, focuses on the sovereignty of God over every nation and human seat of power. It comes from a section of Isaiah chapters 13 through 23 referred to as the oracles against the nation or the judgment on the nations. To understand these oracles, it's important to remember what we studied from Isaiah 7. King Ahaz of Judah, the southern kingdom, refused to place the future of Judah in the hands of God, even with the looming threat from the northern kingdom and her allies. As a result, God promised judgment and eventual restoration for the people of Israel and Judah. In the process, powerful nations around Israel that seemed invincible would cease to exist. While these other civilizations depended on their false gods to empower and protect them, Isaiah reminds the people of Judah that Holy God was not just Lord of Judah, but Lord of all nations, whether they acknowledged Him or not, and of all the created order. The oracles start with a declaration of judgment against Babylon and end with the judgment on Tyre. We're going to take a look at the judgment on Tyre in chapter 23, verses 8 through 12, in order to understand the truth that our God reigns. He knows the future and how man is going to act in this sin-broken world. We have a God, though, who is in control, and He has a plan. The question we will need to answer is, do we believe this, or are we more like King Ahaz and the people of Judah who trembled at the power of the nations and other leaders? Isaiah reminds us in Isaiah chapter 23, verses 8 through 12, that God always has a plan. Beginning in verse 8, he says this: Who planned this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose traders are princes, whose merchants are the honored ones of the earth? The Lord of the armies planned it, to desecrate all its glorious beauty, to disgrace all the honored ones of the earth. Overflow your land like the Nile, daughter of Tarshish. There is no longer anything to restrain you. He stretched out His hand over the sea. He made kingdoms tremble. The Lord has commanded that the Canaanite fortresses be destroyed. He said, You will not celebrate any more, ravished young woman, daughter of Sidon. Get up and cross over to Cyprus. Even there you will have no rest. Notice how Isaiah described Tyre in verse 8. He describes them in this way. They were the bestower of crowns. You see, Tyre's traders and merchants were viewed like royalty with crowns. He even describes them as traders, that their traders are princes. Her merchants were treated like princes and given great honor because everyone wanted to benefit from the trade. The merchants were also described as the honored ones of the earth. Everyone in the known world, the businessmen of to everyone in the known world, the businessmen of Tyre were known and treated with respect. Tyre was a major Phoenician center of trade and power during this period. It was located on an island with large fortifications, a sizable population, and a large fleet of ships. Due to the fact that there were not many harbors along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, Tyre became this major port of trade, a major powerhouse. Because it had been inhabited for such a long period of time, it was very wealthy and powerful. No one in Isaiah's time could ever imagine that city to ever cease to exist. As impressive as Tyre and its people were, they would be no match for the Lord of armies or the Lord of hosts. Verse 9 clearly reveals that God is in control of the nations. Notice in verses 9 through 12 the kind of judgment God had planned for Tyre and all of the region of Phoenicia. First, he had plans to desecrate all its glorious beauty. They were self-reliant and built a city that honored their self-centered way of life. That beauty would be destroyed. He was going to disgrace all the honored ones of the earth. They failed to honor the one true God, so they would be disgraced among men. The princes, the merchants would be disgraced. Notice the statement in the passage, overflow the land like the Nile. Daughter of Tarshish, there is no longer anything to restrain you. Tarshish, likely located in Spain, represented the farthest point of the trading world. This passage is difficult to understand, but we can assume this about the passage. Tyre would be decimated to the extent that trading would no longer be an option in her ports. Her trade relationships with other cities and ports would be over, and the fleeing people of Tyre would overflow the land in order to get away from the invading forces. The Canaanite fortresses will be destroyed is another phrase used. The Phoenicians shared in religious practices common to other Canaanite-derived people and correlated many of their gods to stars, planets, and constellations. God would destroy their idol worship. He also says, you will not celebrate anyone anymore, ravished young woman, daughter of Sidon. This image seems to be that of a young lady who was free and happy, without a care in the world, but then was enslaved in some way. Her joy was gone, and her beauty ruined. Both Tyre and Sidon were important cities of the Phoenician people. Mentioning the two together was a way to refer to the judgment on the Phoenicians in general. Finally, he said, you will have no rest. When the people would attempt to flee to Cyprus, they would find no rest. They could not outrun the judgment of God. Isaiah reminded Judah that this isn't a random event and that God was not caught off guard. He asked a rhetorical question then in verse 8. He asked, who planned this against Tyre? Then he gives the obvious answer in verse 9. The Lord of armies planned it. The people of God may have wondered if he was in charge of the situation in Judah, but Isaiah made it very clear that God is in charge of everything. Even such a powerful, wealthy city as Tyre was in God's control. In the face of judgment, this was good news for the people in the long run. There was nothing in the development of world history that was outside of God's plan. Even though Tyre was a port fortress with tall walls, it would not stand against the judgment of God. Tyre was besieged several times in history and experienced loss each time. Because part of the city was an island fortress, its people did manage to regain some of what was lost and rebuild some of the business over time. Yet they never turned to God. Finally, In 332 BC, Alexander the Great used rubble from the ruined part of the city to build a causeway from the shore to the island citadel so he could besiege it. His siege was successful, he brought down the great city, and it never recovered its former glory after that. Consider New York City as a modern-day equivalent to the city of Tyre. You see, very few people would believe a 21st century prophet who proclaimed that New York would soon be left in ruins. We would probably all call that person crazy. Not only is this city sizable and well established, but the impact of its loss would have major implications for the entire world. Stock markets would crash, and major transportation routes would be snarled. We can perhaps get a small taste of this when we think of the impact on New York City of the terrorist attacks of September 11 in 2001. Magnify that level of destruction to the whole city of New York, and we have just a taste of what Isaiah was predicting for the ancient world when he predicted the fall of Tyre. If we consider what we are currently going through, most of us would never have imagined that our country nor the entire world economy could shut down due to a virus, yet that is what took place. This single event should remind us that we aren't in control, God is. But beyond control, we need to understand that God also, He has a plan. Neither 9/11 nor COVID-19 caught the Lord of Armies by surprise, nor have the wildfires in California, the windstorms in the Midwest, or the hurricanes in the Gulf and Atlantic. When we believe and state that God has a plan, though, most people would question or challenge us regarding the love of God by asking questions like this. If God knew this was going to happen, then why did He not stop it? Or they might ask, how can God be a God of love if His plan included the destruction of cities and nations? So we must ask ourselves how we would respond to those questions. First, we must ask what God is trying to tell us through the circumstances. God is always trying to get our attention so that we might turn to Him and trust totally in Him. In a recent Christian Post interview, Franklin Graham was asked to give his views regarding the pandemic. He stated that this pandemic is a result of a fallen world, a world that has turned its back on God. And he goes on to say, so I would encourage people to pray and let's ask God for help. Many would question the wisdom of Franklin Graham, but that's exactly what we should do. Second, we need to realize that all the things that are taking place are not because of God's lack of love for mankind, but because mankind doesn't embrace the love of God. God could have responded by destroying mankind immediately after the fall of Adam and Eve, or never creating us in the first place, because He knew how we would turn out. He knew what the choices we would make. He could have never provided a solution for restoring us into a right relationship with Him through His Son. He could have just let our broken, sinful, selfish nature take us down the deep, dark path to utter destruction. But He had another plan. It included what would take place over time when His Son would pay the price for our sins, and we would have the opportunity to enjoy an eternal relationship with Him beyond this sin-broken world. His love continues to woo those who haven't repented and offers grace. This plan is not complete until His Son returns again. So as we conclude, consider these questions. What are some things that may cause a person to question if God is really in control? What actions would indicate that someone trusts in a nation, government, or some other form of security more than they do God? How can we avoid shifting our trust away from God? Can you imagine what it would be like if the United States ceased to exist? How would the loss of our country or way of life as we know it today impact our trust in God or impact your trust in God? Do you truly believe that God is sovereign over every nation? How would believing this shape your response to the current issues we are facing in our country? Finally, let's look at the simple yet powerful actions that the sovereign God of the universe took to implement his plan in verses 11 and 12 in Isaiah. First, it states that he stretched out his hand over the sea. He commanded, and then he said, he spoke. Matthew chapter 8, verses 24 through 27, describes an amazing event in the life of Jesus when a violent storm arose while his disciples were on a boat. Suddenly, a violent storm arose on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but Jesus kept sleeping. So the disciples came and woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us! We're going to die." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the sea obey him." Jesus could sleep because he knew the plan. He was the plan. The Lord of armies, the Son of God, spoke as he did in the days of Isaiah, and the wind and the seas obeyed. He is in control of nature, and he is certainly in control of nations. I pray we can all remember this when we face personal challenges in uncertain times.